So joining me now is Boz Zellinger, who was the prosecutor on this case. You were the assistant district attorney when this case was tried. So tell us, Boz, first of all, welcome to the program, and tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, thank you for having me. I grew up in this community. I'm born and raised in Raleigh. Went to law school at Carolina, and then came back to serve as a prosecutor here in Wake County, and did a lot of a variety of fun and weird cases. Really enjoyed my time in the DA's office. Worked there for about a decade, and then went to the U.S. Attorney's office, and then continued my legal career sort of throughout the criminal justice realm here in North Carolina and working statewide.
And I know you probably handled a lot of interesting cases because I covered most of them in the DA's office. How does this case rank in terms of just the really unusual details? And we'll go into those, but just kind of give us an overview of how this ranks in your memory as a career attorney.
Yeah, part of the reason that I wanted to be a prosecutor, and I think people enjoy being prosecutors, is you have this ability to stand up for folks that need help, and be a voice for those who lack one. And here in this case, the stark thing that I think about with this case is just the plight of Laura, and how she went missing, and it was sort of all over the newspaper and all over the media. And so there's a lot of notoriety with this case. It's hard to sort of put them in a spectrum of weirdest cases, but this one certainly, with the forensic evidence, just was sort of stood out because all the forensic evidence kept getting stronger and stronger and helping the state be able to prove what happened.
So let's go back to the beginning. The first report is that Laura Ackerson went missing. She was a mother of two boys. She was sharing custody with this man named Grant Hayes, who was the father of her children. They were not married, they'd never been married. And you get a report that she had gone missing. And the initial thought was that there was some kind of a visitation that week. It was a Wednesday night, I believe, an unscheduled visitation, but that there had been some visitation. And then she disappears. So, what are your first thoughts as a prosecutor when you're given that information?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting because in this case, when this first came up, I was in the middle of a murder trial. And so I was working late hours and really working around the clock. And so I remember, seeing the news stories that this young woman had gone missing and everybody was looking for her. And I didn't really know what to expect. And then I was at the courthouse on a Sunday, and I got a call from my old boss, Colin Willoughby, the district attorney, who said, hey, can you head over to the Raleigh Police Department? There's this, missing woman, and they need some help with some stuff. So I went over there and sat down, and, what they started to tell me, all the evidence sort of pointed to one defendant, Grant Hayes. And as they were telling me this story, someone sort of burst in the room and said, hey, they found parts of her body in Texas. And I joked like, well, you just sort of spoiled the story, because, I certainly heard the end before the beginning, but it was all, as a worst case scenario. I think as a member of the bar, we have a lot of family lawyers who are always trying to make sure that their clients are safe in these custody disputes, and we know how dangerous they can be, and here it really demonstrated how things can go badly.
Yeah, and they were in the middle of a difficult custody battle. And of course, these cases don't rise to the level of calling in an assistant district attorney until it's believed to be suspicious or believed to be a homicide. So at first you have a missing person. I think one of the first things they discovered that started, the red flags immediately was that they found her car, right? They found it in a nearby apartment complex, and that just didn't make sense.
Yeah. I mean, as I recall, she goes missing, and there's this massive search to sort of find anything related to her. The digital forensic stuff starts up, trying to, see where her cell phone was, talking to her friends. And the interesting thing about this case is that all of her friends, had said that Laura had said to them that if she went missing or something bad happened to her, Grant Hayes did it. So, you have all this evidence sort of pointing towards the defendant, but it's not real at that point. And so finding the car nearby Grant Hayes's apartment, I think it was a parking lot over, is, starts to, put more of a target on where detectives need to look. And I think the next thing they did was they did a search warrant for his apartment as well.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, really early, they're focusing on him, and part of the reason is that he and his new wife and his baby daughter, so he had had another child, a third child with this woman, Amanda, left for Texas on this kind of random trip, and I think they even talked to him once by cell phone, and he was very vague about why they were going and what they were doing. Talk about the that search of the apartment. What are some of the things that came up?
I think in a lot of these murder cases, you find evidence of the cleanup as opposed to evidence of the murder. And I think that was true with this one. There was a strong odor of bleach in the air. And the Raleigh police detectives, who are some of the sharpest folks out there, I mean, they dismantled the bathroom in that apartment trying to find any evidence they can, but it was remarkably clean. And they actually went to the apartment below and cut into the ceiling to try to get the, plumbing out to see if there was any blood in there. While they were doing that, they actually noticed the garbage trucks coming to pick up garbage and realized that might be something that could have some evidentiary value. And so they went to the local garbage dump, and sort of when the apartment complex dumpster was laid out, in that they found a bunch of evidence that was really helpful, including gloves and trash bags and items that had Laura Ackerson's DNA on them. And so that's a pretty powerful indicator that Laura was in that apartment. And at the same time, they find evidence from her friends that she had made this phone call right before she went over to Grant Hayes's house. And we were able to play that phone call for the jury, and that voicemail was stark. She's saying, "I'm going to go over there. I'm not sure what's going to happen." You can kind of hear a little bit of trepidation in her voice. And so all that sort of helps the jury understand, what was going on immediately leading up to this murder.
And in the meantime, you guys are searching the apartment. Grant Hayes and his wife, Amanda, they drive to Texas with a rented U-Haul. And you eventually are able to see all of his actions through different surveillance video right after they left, right after Laura was killed. One of them is he's seen buying a saw at I think it was a Walmart. How were you? What did you piece together from some of the evidence from the home and also some of that surveillance video?
Sure. So these detectives, have a really difficult time in that some of the best evidence comes from witnesses who are family members of the defendant. And so that's what happened here when they were searching Grant and Amanda's house or apartment. Amanda's daughter, Shay, said, "Hey, there's a saw manual that's not usually here." And that sort of led to an investigation to try to find a saw that might have been used to dismember Laura Ackerson. And so they're able to go to this Walmart and get video surveillance and talk to folks at the Walmart and see Grant just, very calm and deliberately shopping for a saw to dismember his ex-wife or ex-girlfriend's body, at 2:00 in the morning. And he also buys goggles and bleach and trash bags and all these things are paint a pretty clear picture of what's going on. And so the hard work of those folks to, be able to run all that stuff down really sort of illustrated, what was going on in that apartment. But then we still had a big problem of, trying to figure out what led them to leave to Texas. And so our Raleigh police detectives headed off to Texas. They basically were pinging Grant Hayes's phone, and he was smart. He turned off his phone. But then he turned it on at one point in Texas, and they were able to figure out that Amanda's sister, Grant Hayes' sister-in-law, lived in Fort Bend County, Texas. And so the Raleigh Police Department headed out there, and drove throughout the night to get there to investigate further.
And this is another example. You're talking about the family members. This is another example of a family member sharing information that was relevant in this case because they got there. And her reaction, so Amanda's sister's reaction, was pretty dramatic when she opened the door and saw the Raleigh police officers there.
Yeah, our detectives, drove through the night. The defendants had sort of a a 48-hour head start on the Raleigh Police Department because no one knew, that she was missing until a day or two later. But when they get there, Karen, Amanda's sister, answers the door and they ask if they can talk to her. And she says, can we pray first? Which was a pretty poignant moment, I think, for our detectives in realizing that they're about to get some good information about what had happened there in Texas.
And what did she tell them?
And so, she tells them that Grant and Amanda had been there. They sort of showed up on short notice, presumably to bring some sort of armoire or something to them, which is obviously a cover story. And then she sort of breaks down and starts telling more information about what really happened. They asked if she had like a septic tank or something, asking if there was a place basically to dispose of body without outright saying it, before finally sort of focusing on the creek near Karen's house, asking if it had alligators in it, and then taking out her son's John boat into the creek one night with a bunch of coolers. And so,
Right. So that was Grant and Amanda saying, hey, we're going to
yeah,
take the boat out. And she thought that was odd. And then didn't she also say that Amanda told her she had done something to Laura?
yeah. So I think one morning after breakfast, Karen Barry said, I think she said, I can't remember exactly what she said, but she remembered that Amanda had said that Amanda had hurt her, or they had hurt her, and that she was dead. And so that's a pretty powerful admission and a pretty huge piece of evidence, not just in trying to convict Grant Hayes of what happened, but also Amanda, that this person was confused about sort of who said, Karen saying, I hurt her, was that being done to cover for Grant? Was he nearby? Was Amanda really admitting to the murder? Those are all things we sort of had to dig into.
And one of the other things that you caught Amanda doing, and I thought this was really interesting, there was a surveillance camera in the woods. Talk about that, why it was there, and what you saw.
Yeah. So in this case, all the forensic evidence is sort of incredibly helpful. The Raleigh Police Department and Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office did this amazing job of tracking everything down. And so there's just all this evidence starting to pile up to show, who's responsible for this murder. And then, at the end of it, there's a wildlife person in Texas who had set up still cameras at the end of this sort of dirt road, sort of rural road, to capture people dumping garbage. And they're, captured on that camera as Amanda Hayes pulling up a truck, getting out, and getting rid of some acid that was used by the defendants while they were there in Texas to try to break down the body. And so, she was by herself. Her defense was going to be that she was forced or coerced into this. And, here she is acting independently to try to destroy evidence.
Yeah. And I mean, that idea that you could destroy a body with the evidence, and I believe it was called muriatic acid. Again, something that you might see in a movie, but not necessarily something that works. So that was another thing that was kind of crazy.
Yeah, and I think Breaking Bad had just come out, or it was like
oh,
a
that's
year or two
probably what
before,
they
and there
saw
was,
it in.
yeah,
Yeah,
and so I think that's where they got it from. But
yeah.
even when they used it, we found a forensic dentist who could say that the acid caused etching on Laura's teeth, and so it was almost this like volley and response where everything the defendants did, law enforcement was able to figure out.
So you get this information from Karen, Amanda's sister, about the creek, and obviously at that point you're thinking, okay, they came in a U-Haul, they had multiple coolers in the U-Haul. It sounds like they've dumped this evidence in the creek. So you have to call in divers from Houston to look at the evidence in the creek. Really challenging conditions for them in that creek, not to mention the emotional toll that it must have taken on them. I mean, what did they find?
It was stark. I had never spoken to divers who did this kind of work. There's not a lot of dismemberment cases in Raleigh or North Carolina or, the country for that matter. I mean, it's kind of a wild thing to do. And so they testified at trial, and what they saw when they dove was that they're looking for this sort of sheen on the top of the water, which is the fats from the body breaking down, which is kind of nauseating to think about. But they plan on doing these dives, not being able to see anything. And they do sort of concentric circles out from a fixed point. And as they did that, they started to see a sheen, and they were able to recover some parts of Laura's body. They recovered a torso, they recovered the head, and then a couple days later, like a femur was found. But, a lot of the body was never recovered.
And it's, such an interesting situation because they're in the water that has alligators in it, because that was the whole purpose of them dumping it there. It's dark, it's murky, and they're bringing up these body parts. I know I remember talking to some of them afterwards, and it was very emotional, but it was a job that they needed to do.
Yeah, I think in a missing person case, everyone, has this hope, and hope was dashed at that moment. And to see someone be murdered is obviously one of the most horrific things. But then to see the way that Laura Ackerson's body was treated afterwards really gave you some insights into Grant Hayes's intent and, sort of what he wanted to accomplish, because, he didn't just kill her. He basically tried to erase her from the face of the earth.
So the next step is trying to match the marks on the bones of the remains found with the marks from that saw, because you need direct evidence. Yet there were some autopsies done. And when the autopsies were done in Texas, there were some other marks that were placed on those bones, and you had to figure out what was what. So you turned to Dr. Ann Ross, a forensic anthropologist at North Carolina State University, and she came up with a plan. Talk about that.
Yeah, she's incredibly cool, and I was honored to work with her. It's rare that as a prosecutor you get to work with, someone, an anthropologist of her, acclaim. And so we had this problem when the body was recovered. It went to a medical examiner's office in Texas, and there were some cuttings made of the bones. There's like a protocol in autopsies where you're supposed to cut the area that was cut and then mark the side that the autopsy pathologist, cut with like ink. Well, that didn't happen. So when the body came back to North Carolina, our medical examiner's office, working with Dr. Ross, had a lot of, puzzle building to do to try to figure out, what was done by the anthropologist there. And they were able to figure it out. And so not only did she sort of figure out exactly what kind of saw was used on Laura Ackerson's body, but she's able to find some other evidence that was really helpful for the state, in that she could find places where sawing had started to occur and then stopped. She's also able to find some marks on the vertebrae of Laura Ackerson that indicated that there was a potential stabbing done. And so that evidence was incredibly powerful. One of the most difficult parts of this case was trying to get Dr. Ross everything she needed to be able to do this study of these bones. And apparently, weirdly for me, I'm Jewish, and so it didn't feel very kosher. But we had to acquire a pig because Dr. Ross needed pig bones, are apparently a good sort of stand-in for human bones.
A proxy, right?
Yeah,
right.
A proxy. And so we had to procure a pig, and most of the pigs in this area are being used for barbecue. So that was an interesting adventure. And then when she actually came to testify, we wanted to be able to have her display and explain all the different, cuts that were made and where these injuries occurred. And so we had to procure a skeleton, like a real one. And so we had to, call up doctors' offices trying to find a skeleton.
I remember you had that, in the courtroom. And I mean, I think the really interesting thing, and I'll go into more of this in the show, but I mean, she took that saw that your investigators purchased because they knew that he had purchased one, even though you never found the original. She made a cut on the pig bone, and then she put it under a microscope and put it next to the cuts on Laura's bones, and she was able to make a match. And then you get a call. I think you were in a meeting, as I recall at the time. You get a call that there's a match. I mean, what did that mean for the case?
I mean, it was incredibly powerful because, you have, in a case like this, you have a lot of questions about what happened in that apartment. And when you have a scientist able to say, this saw that he purchased with this blade can definitively be said to have made this cut mark, that really, puts an idea in the jury's mind and a picture in their mind of exactly what happened after this murder. The jury instructions for premeditation and deliberation say that a jury can contemplate not just what happened before or during a murder, but also what happened after a murder. And so here you have this defendant who's incredibly deliberate and trying to find the best saw, moments after he murdered someone to dismember them. And so that evidence is, incredibly powerful for a jury. I was very excited that, all these question marks that were out there were being answered by the tremendous investigation in this case.
And they both went to trial. They were both charged with murder, and kind of in a way pointed the finger at each other. He says, she did it, I covered it up. She says, he did it, I didn't know anything about it, but then I helped in the aftermath. One of the stories, and I know there were many stories that came out, was that, oh no, Laura had come to the apartment and was going to give up her children for $25,000. And we had a contract, we had written it out. And that note became kind of a very focal point of both trials. Talk about that a little.
I thought that note was incredibly powerful. I don't know that the media or even folks involved in the trial thought it was as powerful as I did, but we sent the note. There's this note that was found during the investigation, during the search warrant into Grant and Amanda's apartment, and the note had two sets of handwriting on it. And one of the sets of handwriting, the note was sent off to the FBI in Quantico, and we had someone from their handwriting expert testify, and they were able to testify that half of the note was Laura Ackerson's handwriting. So it wasn't faked. And what that note said was that Laura was agreeing to give away her kids, give up custody of her kids in exchange for $25,000, which is something that every person who knew her, every, scintilla of evidence that we recovered from her email, from her writings, it just indicated that Laura Ackerson would never give up her children. She was a good mother and dedicated to making sure that they were okay for the rest of their lives. And so you have her doing something that is completely against her own nature. And she's alive at that point. And so, we don't know if it's under duress. We don't know if it's under coercion. There's some interesting parts of the note where she dated it in a way that was sort of different than she dated everything else. Like in her journal, she used, hyphens as opposed to using slash marks in that note. So it just raised this question of what was going on. But that she was alive in the apartment and doing something that she otherwise would never do. And so that was pretty powerful. On top of that, the note, they could tell microscopically, had something written on top of it. There was basically a draft. This was the second draft, and the folks from the FBI are able to figure that out. So again, the fact that that there's something bad going on while she's alive indicated to me that, the defendant had this intent to do something bad at that point and while she was alive. And so I think that really repelled any argument that this could have been, a second degree murder where there wasn't sort of this premeditation and deliberation.
Yeah. And again, there were so many stories, but he was an aspiring musician. He had several failed business ventures, and he really was broke. And here he was, paying child support, and he had another child, and he was married. And so money, he certainly didn't have any money. He certainly didn't have $25,000. So that didn't make any sense. And there was also some indication, they had a hearing coming up, that there was a likelihood of her getting full custody because they had done a psychological evaluation of him, and things were not looking good for him in the child custody department. He does not testify at trial, but he has strange behavior in the courtroom, I would say, as a journalist watching many trials over the years. First of all, he doesn't dress appropriately. And second of all, he appears at many times during the trial to be kind of jovial with at least one member of the defense counsel.
Yeah, it's hard to say how people react to certain things, but it certainly seemed like he did not. I don't know. I can't put my head in Grant Hayes's mind. It's really hard to figure out why he acted the way he acted. And the biggest example of that was when the last piece of evidence that was played, which was the song that he had penned. And so, I don't know if it was just so overwhelmingly, there's so much overwhelming evidence of his guilt that he just sort of gave up. But he certainly did not act like most defendants act.
Yeah, I mean, he was dressed kind of casually, like you might if you were going to a party or a nightclub, and most defense attorneys require their defendants to wear a shirt and a tie and a jacket if they can muster one up. And then this song was basically this was Broomstick Rider, right?
Correct.
Is
Yeah.
that the one we're talking about? Yeah, he had written a song basically calling a woman a witch and talking about wanting to get rid of her and never could really prove that that song, because it was an older song, had been written about Laura, but it certainly made it seem like he had negative intentions towards women when you saw the song. And he tapped his foot and he bopped along to the song.
Yeah, I think that was perhaps the best piece of evidence in the entire trial because, it showed the hatred that Grant Hayes had towards Laura Ackerson. I absolutely think that song was about Laura Ackerson. The descriptions in it, the lyrics of it, make it pretty clear that he wanted to kill his baby's mama and was talking about putting a price tag on her head. And so, if the jury had any question about his intent, in a case like this, you worry that you don't know exactly what happened in the apartment. It's very hard to prove because the only people that know what happened are the murderers and the victim who's dead and can't testify. And so, getting a piece of evidence like that sort of indicates the defendant's intent and how the defendant feels about the victim is so powerful. And then, I remember we waited to play that until the very end of the state's evidence. And so, typically in a trial, you admit a piece of evidence and then you publish it or play it for the jury. You admit a piece of evidence and publish it for the jury. With that, we elected to wait until all of the evidence was done and then play that last. And so I remember we had a big dispute between my trial partner and I about whether we should hand out the lyrics to the jury so that they could sort of read it on a piece of paper or portray the lyrics in the screen in the courtroom. We decided to put it on the screen, and I was kind of happy we did at the end because, here they are reading these lyrics and the defendant starts like bobbing his head and sort of rocking out to the rap song that he wrote about killing the victim that he's on trial for. It was just a surreal experience. I remember walking out of the courtroom and my then girlfriend, now wife, called me and was like, "You have to go look at WRAL." And like the headline was like, "Hayes jams out in court to song about killing victim." And it was just such a weird fact scenario.
It was, and we were the camera in the courtroom. Of course, we were the pool camera, so we were sharing that with the rest of the media. But my photographer that I worked with at the time, Chad Flowers, I just remember him zooming in on that moment. And like when we got back to start working on the story, he said, "You've got to look at this. You've got to see what this looked like." So he's convicted.
Yeah.
He gets life in prison. And then Amanda is tried and she does testify. And her story is that his story was that Amanda had knocked Laura out unintentionally, that Laura had fallen, hit her head, and that there had been some kind of a struggle, but that it was unintentional and that he covered it up. Her story was that she knew nothing, that she had come into the room and seen Laura on the floor, and he had said, "Oh, there's been an accident. I'll get her medical help. You get out, you leave." So she basically just says, "I had nothing to do with it." And she was she was an actress, right? And she did a really pretty good job in the courtroom of being demure and being kind of the innocent victim in this situation.
Yeah, it's hard to think that a woman could be involved. With talking about gender roles, I think that people just have this sort of preconceived notion that like a woman couldn't do that to another woman. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's exactly what happened. And that was something that we were really trying to sort of fight against because it's just hard to sort of reconcile that, there's a lot of folks who, live in separated or divorced families and, appreciate the, person's ex-spouse and the way that they care for children. I mean, these folks had 2 kids in common. And, Amanda got in the courtroom and, put on her best. She was an actress in The Stepford Wives. She was an extra in that movie, which was just, incredibly appropriate for how she acted. And so, she played her role well. She acted like she was coerced the whole time. But then again, the investigation was really helpful in being able to repel some of those arguments. Detectives have found cameras that the defendants had taken to Texas and back. In those photographs that were captured, it's like a family trip. Amanda's smiling and looks very happy. And so it's kind of hard to say that she was, under coercion this whole time, especially when she's like dumping acid and, actively participating in this conspiracy. And then I think one of the most interesting things was when the detectives were in Texas, they actually took that boat that the defendants used to dump Laura's body in the creek. And we kind of got in an argument because I was like, we're going to need that boat. Like, we need it. You need to bring it back to Raleigh because we're going to need it. And they're like, how are we going to get like a John boat back to Raleigh? And so we had this like argument, and they ended up having to get like a truck and trailer to drag it back. And then it was incredibly helpful that we had that boat because we were able to do a view of the boat and sort of the bowels of the courthouse, where the jury could walk around the boat and look at it and see all the areas where there was blood. And there's no way that Amanda could just like sit in front of the boat and have no idea that Grant was throwing body parts in the water. Like, that boat was so small. It was very clear that she had to be involved, especially, considering the forensic evidence. And so I think folks are able to see through her sort of claims and her acting up on the witness stand. And then, we also had her statements to her sister where she said, I hurt Laura. So I think that was pretty powerful as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I think they had these two different stories, and maybe that was by design to confuse the juries, to say, well, we don't know who did it. One of them did it. We don't know who did it. But we do know for sure that they both participated in the aftermath, and to different extents, obviously. But we do know that. So she's convicted, and she ends up, I guess, getting a lesser sentence because she gets second-degree murder. But then in Texas, they tried her with something else. Talk about that a little. And that gave her more time.
Yeah, so she got convicted of second-degree murder, which is, just saying that she didn't have the premeditation and deliberation, which, ultimately I think is fine under our North Carolina case law. But, it's a little bit frustrating because we thought that she had a pretty active role. And then, we find out that these Texas prosecutors in Fort Bend County were charging her with a crime of disposing of a body. And so, they took a lot of the evidence that we used and were able to convict her of those crimes down there and get her some additional time. She doesn't have a life sentence, but that helped her be held more accountable for her actions.
So do you feel like with the outcomes of both of these trials that justice was served in this case for Laura?
No. I mean, there's nothing that can ever be fair about what happened in this case. I mean, I'm a parent now. I wasn't then. And I understand how Laura Ackerson, all she wanted was to be a parent to her kids and raise her kids and make sure her kids were safe. And there's nothing that we can do in a courtroom that can ever, sort of be just or fair for what happened to her. Those little boys are going to grow up without their mom. Their father's in custody for the rest of his life. It's kind of a horrible situation. I do hope that the accountability that the defendants received, makes the community safer and makes people feel better about what happened. But I still, in these cases, you read all of the victims' emails and, do a deep dive into everything, her custody evaluation, trying to sort of figure out exactly what was going on in the person's life that led to this murder. And it's just so heartbreaking. And so, I think it was a just outcome, but I don't think that there's anything that could ever be just, because all this woman wanted to do was be a good mom to her boys, and Grant Hayes took that away from her and away from them.
Yeah, and I interviewed him multiple times. I think one early on when he was just charged but hadn't been convicted. And I asked him on every occasion about the disposal of the body. And he basically said that he didn't have a choice in order to get the victim out of the apartment. And then in this one of the further interviews I did, I think after the conviction, he basically talked about, holding her upright because of the rigor mortis, and then disposing of, cutting the body parts, disposing of them. I don't think anybody can hear that and not be just incredibly appalled and disgusted by those actions.
Yeah, it sort of speaks to the depravity of what human beings can do to each other. We live in this, wonderful community, and it's hard to believe. There's a lot of murders that you see that are sort of commonplace, but this one just had such a increased amount of animosity towards the victim. I remember when I was preparing for closing arguments in these cases, like doing some research about dismemberment cases, and there's some like psychological writings out there. We didn't end up using experts, but that say that dismemberment, deep in the psyche of the defendant, is not just killing somebody, but trying to sort of erase them, like I said previously. And I think that's what happened here. That Grant Hayes was just so angry about the fact that he couldn't go and leave North Carolina and leave his kids behind and leave Laura Ackerson behind, but that he was being sort of hooked into this custody dispute, and it was going to cost him a lot of money, and he was going to have to stay nearby. And I think that anger just grew and grew and grew, and it's just a hard case to sort of comprehend. I mean, it just speaks to the depravity of what human beings can do to each other, which is something you don't normally hear like folks talk about in like war. But here it was, in an apartment complex near the mall.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Boz, for your insight on this really difficult case. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.